Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The year is 1808. In the heart of Topkapi Palace, the silence is a shroud. Sultan Selim III, a composer and a visionary, is a prisoner in his own home. He can hear the shouts from the courtyard, the roar of an army coming to save him, and the frantic footsteps of assassins sent to end him. The man who dreamed of a new future for a dying empire now faces the bloody blade of its past. His life, a grand symphony of reform and art, is about to reach its final violent crescendo. In the heart of the sprawling Topkapi Palace, within a suite of opulent but isolated rooms known as the Kafes, or the cage, a prince was dreaming of a world he could not see. This was Shehzade Selim. Born in 1761, he was the son of Sultan Mustafa III, but the Ottoman law of succession was a brutal one. To prevent the fratricidal wars that had once torn the empire apart, princes of the blood were no longer executed upon a new sultan's ascension. Instead, they were confined, living under constant surveillance, their lives a strange paradox of luxury and imprisonment. The shadow of the bowstring, the traditional method of royal execution, was a constant, silent companion. Yet, within this gilded cage, Selim's mind was allowed to soar. His father, a reformer himself, ensured his son received an education far exceeding that of his predecessors. While other princes languished in idleness and despair, Selim consumed books on European history, military strategy, and political science. He became a master of arts that seemed antithetical to the grim reality of his confinement. He was a poet of profound sensitivity, and most remarkably, a composer of genius. His fingers would dance across the strings of the tanbur. His voice would rise in haunting melodies of the Mevlevi spiritual tradition. His music was not a mere pastime. It was an escape, a language through which he could express the melancholy of his isolation and his yearning for a different future. He even dared to do the unthinkable. He initiated a secret correspondence with King Louis XVI of France, a ghost-like communication with a world of enlightenment and progress that existed just beyond the Bosphorus. He saw the rot in his own empire and believed, with the burning conviction of a captive idealist, that he was the man destined to heal it. But his education taught him a dangerous truth. The very forces that kept him locked away were the same ones he would one day have to confront to save the throne. While Prince Selim composed his symphonies in the silence of the palace, the Ottoman Empire was screaming in agony. The once feared state, the conqueror of nations, was now a lumbering giant, bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The 18th century had been a relentless series of humiliations. On the battlefield, the disciplined armies of Catherine the Great's Russia and the Habsburgs of Austria had shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. The Treaty of Küçük Kaynarca in 1774 was not merely a loss of territory. It was a scar carved deep into the empire's soul. For the first time, a foreign power, Russia, was granted the right to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman lands, a humiliating pretext for perpetual interference. The Black Sea, for centuries an Ottoman lake, was now open to Russian warships. The economy was in shambles, crippled by outdated trade practices, capitulations to European powers, and rampant corruption that siphoned wealth from the treasury into the pockets of pashas and viziers. But the most immediate cancer was internal. The Janissaries, once the elite shock troops of the Sultan, had devolved into a privileged, corrupt, and politically powerful Praetorian Guard. They were kingmakers and kingbreakers. They were more adept at rioting in the streets of Constantinople for pay than fighting on the frontiers. They refused to adopt new weapons or tactics, viewing any change as a threat to their entrenched power. They were a state within a state, a Praetorian Guard that held the Sultan himself hostage. The ulama, the clerical elite, often allied with the Janissaries, sanctifying the status quo and denouncing any European-inspired innovation as heresy. This was the inheritance awaiting Selim, an empire on the verge of collapse, held together by tradition, yet being destroyed by it. The throne was not a prize, It was a death sentence, a seat at the head of a banquet of decay. On April 7th, 1789, the doors of the Kafes swung open. Sultan Abdulhamid I was dead. At the age of 27, Selim walked out of the shadows of his confinement and into the blinding light of absolute power. He was now Sultan Selim III, Padishah, Caliph of the Faithful. For the people of Constantinople and the few forward-thinking minds in the Divan, his ascension felt like the dawn after a long, dark night. Here was a sultan unlike any in living memory. He was young, vigorous, intelligent, and most importantly, he was a man of vision. He had spent decades diagnosing the sickness of his empire. Now, he held the surgeon's knife. He immediately broke with the secluded tradition of his predecessors. He attended meetings of the Imperial Council, the Divan, in person, listening, questioning, and commanding with an energy that shocked the complacent bureaucracy. He walked among his people in disguise to see their conditions firsthand. His message was clear. The age of decay was over. A new era was beginning. From this whirlwind of initial activity, a grand design began to emerge. The Nizam-e-Jadid, the new order. This was to be his life's work. While often remembered as a purely military reform, it was far more ambitious. It was a root and branch attempt to modernize the state. He established new embassies in European capitals, London, Vienna, Berlin, Paris, to learn from the West, not just to fight it. He initiated reforms in taxation and provincial administration. But at its heart, the new order was a new army. An army trained, equipped, and organized along modern European lines, loyal only to the Sultan, designed to supplant the rebellious and ineffective Janissaries. Barracks were built, French and Swedish officers were hired as advisors, and new factories produced modern muskets and cannon. For a fleeting moment, hope was palpable. The musician prince was now the Sultan of Hope, composing a new symphony for a dying empire. The Sultan of Hope soon discovered that his crown was not made of gold, but of thorns. Every step he took towards reform was a piercing agony. The forces of reaction, dormant but not dead, began to stir. The Nizam-e-Jadid, his great hope for salvation, was seen by the old guard as a declaration of war on their very existence. The Janissaries watched with fury as the state's treasure was lavished on this new, alien army. They saw in the crisp uniforms and disciplined drills of the new order not the future of the empire, but their own obsolescence and death. Their barracks became hotbeds of sedition, their whispers in the coffeehouses of the capital turning into open threats. They were not alone. The powerful ulama, the guardians of religious law, viewed Selim's European-inspired reforms with deep suspicion. To them, adopting the methods of the infidel was a path to damnation, a betrayal of the faith and the sacred traditions that had made the empire great. They preached sermons that subtly and not so subtly painted the Sultan as a heretic, a dangerous innovator who was abandoning the path of God. The provincial notables, the powerful derabes, who ruled their lands like feudal lords, also resisted. Selim's attempts to centralize power and reform taxation threatened their autonomy and their wealth. They saw the Sultan's reforms not as a national project, but as a direct assault on their personal fiefdoms. Selim found himself increasingly isolated. He was fighting a war on two fronts, against external enemies like Russia and Napoleonic France, and a more insidious war against the internal enemies of his own vision. The treasury was drained by the constant need to fund both the old, useless army and the new, expensive one. Every success of the Nizam-e-Jadid troops in minor skirmishes only deepened the Janissaries' hatred. The symphony of hope he had sought to compose was being drowned out by a rising chorus of dissent, a funeral dirge for his dreams. Sultan Selim III understood a brutal, undeniable truth. The heart of the Ottoman Empire was failing, and its name was the Janissary Corps. Once the world's most feared infantry, they were now a decadent, entitled militia, more adept at running coffeehouses and intimidating merchants than facing a disciplined European line. They were a tumor on the state, a Praetorian guard that made and unmade sultans at will. To save his empire, Selim knew he had to perform radical surgery. He had to create something new, something born of the very fire that threatened to consume him. He called it the Nizami Sedid, the New Order. This was not a mere reform. It was a revolution from the throne. On dusty parade grounds outside the ancient walls of Constantinople, a new kind of Ottoman soldier was being forged. They wore blue uniforms in the French style, not the flowing robes of old. They carried modern bayoneted muskets, not antiquated matchlocks. They learned to march in step, to form squares, to obey the crisp commands of European-trained officers. This was an army built on merit, discipline, and loyalty, not to a corrupt corps, but to the Sultan and the state. Selim poured the state's treasure into this venture, establishing new foundries for cannons, new barracks, and new schools to train his officers. He brought in French, Swedish, and other European advisors, men who knew the grim arithmetic of modern warfare. But every perfectly executed drill, every gleaming new cannon, was a direct insult to the old guard. The Janissaries watched from the smoky coffee houses of the capital, their contempt simmering. They saw not a savior army, but a blasphemous imitation of the infidel, a threat to their power, their income, and their very way of life. Selim was building his new army in the shadow of the old, a dangerous gamble where two rival military forces now coexisted within the same city walls. The air grew thick with tension. It was a question not of if, but when, the inevitable confrontation would come. Beyond the clang of the foundry and the crack of the musket, another, more subtle revolution was taking place within the walls of the Topkapi Palace. It played out not on the battlefield, but in the quiet salons and hushed chambers of the court. Its general was Selim himself, but his weapons were the ney, the tanbur, and the ink of a poet's pen. Selim III was more than a sultan. He was a composer of profound talent, a poet, and a calligrapher of great skill. His court was not merely a center of power, but a vibrant hub of artistic creation. He gathered around him the finest musicians and poets of the age, transforming the palace into a conservatory where the rich traditions of Ottoman classical music were not just preserved, but infused with new life. He composed intricate musical suites, known as pesrev and saz semai, works of such haunting beauty and complexity that they are still performed today. This was not a mere diversion. For Selim, art was an essential pillar of his new order. He believed a modernized state required a refined soul. He envisioned a new Ottoman man, one who was as comfortable discussing Persian poetry or a complex musical mode as he was with military strategy. This cultural renaissance was his attempt to build a deeper foundation for his reforms, to create an intellectual and artistic elite that could embrace and champion his vision of a sophisticated modern empire. But to his enemies, this symphony of change sounded like a funeral dirge for tradition. The stern, pious ulama and the brutish Janissary commanders saw this flourishing of arts as a sign of weakness, of decadent, foreign corruption. They heard the delicate notes of the ney and imagined the collapse of the old martial virtues that had forged the empire. They saw a sultan who spent his nights composing music instead of poring over religious texts. In their eyes, Selim's passion was not a symbol of a new dawn, but proof that he was abandoning the sacred path of his ancestors, lulled into complacency by the seductive, dangerous music of the West. As Selim began his great project, a political earthquake erupted in the West, sending tremors that would eventually shake the very foundations of his own empire. In 1789, the same year he ascended the throne, the Bastille fell in Paris. The French Revolution was a distant storm, one which Ottoman diplomats initially viewed with a mixture of curiosity and detached satisfaction, pleased to see their European rivals embroiled in internal chaos. But this was no ordinary war or dynastic squabble. It was a revolution of ideas, and ideas respected no borders. The concepts of liberté, égalité, fraternité were a political contagion. More potent and more dangerous for a multi-ethnic empire like the Ottomans was the idea of nationalism, the radical notion that a people, defined by common language and culture, constituted a nation and had the right to rule themselves. This was poison to an empire built on the principle of a divinely ordained sultan ruling over a mosaic of peoples: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Serbs, Armenians, and more. The irony was devastating. Selim was actively importing French military advisors, French technology, and French administrative models to build his Nizami Tadid. He sought the methods of the new France, but desperately wanted to insulate his realm from its ideology. He was trying to borrow the flame of Napoleon's army without getting burned by the fire of his revolution. But the ideas arrived anyway, carried in diplomatic pouches, in the conversations of merchants, and in the minds of students. In the Balkans, Serbian and Greek intellectuals began to whisper of national destiny. In Egypt, Napoleon's brief invasion was a military failure, but an ideological thunderclap, demonstrating the power of a modern national army and exposing the weakness of the old Ottoman order. Selim found himself caught in a terrifying paradox. The very forces of modernity he hoped to harness to save his empire were also providing the philosophical ammunition for its potential disintegration. He was fighting a war on two fronts, against the internal decay of the old guard and against a new, invisible enemy, an idea that threatened to tear his world apart from within. Selim's vision extended far beyond the barracks and the concert hall. He was attempting to re-engineer the empire's relationship with the world. For centuries, the Sublime Porte had viewed Europe with a sense of innate superiority, a realm of warring infidel kingdoms from which little could be learned. Embassies were temporary, sent for specific missions, with the expectation that the world would come to Constantinople, not the other way around. Selim shattered this tradition. He understood that in the new age of global power politics, isolation was a death sentence. He established the first permanent Ottoman embassies in the great capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. This was a revolutionary act. It was a tacit admission of parity, a recognition that the Ottoman Empire was now one power among many, and that it needed to learn, negotiate, and observe to survive. These new ambassadors were not just messengers, they were Selim's eyes and ears. They were tasked with studying European military techniques, industrial technology, and political structures. They sent back detailed reports that became the blueprints for reform. New factories, built on European models, began to produce paper and textiles. A state printing press was established, publishing works of science, mathematics, and military theory translated into Turkish. He was building the infrastructure of a modern state, brick by brick, policy by policy. He was creating a new class of Ottoman: the diplomat, the engineer, the modern officer, men who could bridge the gap between East and West. Yet, every new embassy, every translated book was seen by the traditionalists as another step away from their own world. They saw not progress, but capitulation. They saw Ottoman officials in London and Paris as hostages to foreign influence, and the new factories as a betrayal of the guild system. Selim was building a European dream of efficiency, diplomacy, and progress, but he was building it on the foundations of a deeply conservative Ottoman world that viewed his every move with profound suspicion. He was an architect of the future, working in a society that remained fiercely loyal to its past. Progress is rarely a gentle tide. For Selim III, it was a raging flood that threatened to drown an entire world. His Nizami Jedid, the new order, was not seen as salvation by the empire's established powers. To them, it was heresy. At the heart of this resistance were the Janissaries. For centuries, they had been the foundation of Ottoman military might, the Sultan's sword. But by the late 18th century, that sword had grown dull and rusted with privilege. They were a state within a state, a Praetorian Guard more interested in commerce and political intrigue than in battlefield discipline. Selim's new, European-drilled army was a direct existential threat. Every crisp uniform, every French command shouted on the training grounds, was an insult to their legacy and a clear signal that their pampered, powerful era was ending. Their fury was primal, a defense of identity itself. Allied with them, in spirit, if not always in action, was a powerful faction of the ulama, the clerical elite. These scholars and jurists were the guardians of sacred tradition. They saw Selim's reforms, his fascination with European music, his adoption of foreign military tactics, his diplomatic overtures to Christian powers, as a dangerous deviation, a bid'ah. It was a corruption of the pure, God-given order that had once made the empire great. To them, the empire's weakness stemmed not from outdated institutions, but from a turning away from the true path. The solution was not to imitate the infidel, but to return to the righteous ways of their ancestors. This confluence of military and religious conservatism created a formidable wall of opposition. It was a coalition built on fear, the Janissaries' fear of obsolescence and the ulama's fear of spiritual decay. Together, they viewed Selim not as a reformer, but as a cultural traitor, and their simmering rage began to boil over into open defiance. The most dangerous threats to a sultan rarely came from beyond the palace walls. They festered within, in the gilded corridors and shadowed gardens of the Topkapi Palace itself. While the Janissaries seethed in their barracks, a more subtle and insidious poison was spreading through the heart of the court. Selim, for all his vision, was surrounded by a web of intricate loyalties and ancient rivalries. Every reform he enacted created not just external enemies, but internal ones. Courtiers who had prospered under the old system saw their influence wane, replaced by Selim's new crop of reform-minded advisors. Every appointment of a French engineer or a European-trained officer was a slight to a pasha or vizier, whose family had served the dynasty for generations. The air grew thick with whispers. In the secluded chambers of the harem, in the quiet corners of the divan, factions began to coalesce. These were not men who shouted their treason in the streets. They were masters of the veiled comment, the strategic rumor, the carefully placed doubt. They questioned the Sultan's piety, his judgment, his very manhood. They preyed on the anxieties of those who felt left behind by his relentless pace of change. Selim's own mother, Mihrisha Sultan, a powerful figure in her own right, was caught in this cross-current. While she supported her son, she was also a product of the old ways, and the whispers of the court would have reached her ears, planting seeds of doubt. The Sultan, a poet and musician, was a man of sensitivity. He must have felt the chill, the shifting allegiances, the smiles that no longer reached the eyes of those who bowed before him. His sanctuary had become a gilded cage, and the keepers were slowly, silently, turning the lock. The Janissary Corps was a living paradox, the empire's supposed protectors and its most persistent source of instability. Their shadow fell long and dark over Istanbul, a constant reminder of who held the true power of the sword. By Selim's reign, their martial prowess was a distant memory. They were now a bloated, hereditary caste of thousands, many of whom were shopkeepers and artisans who collected a soldier's pay without ever touching a musket. Their loyalty was not to the Sultan, but to their corps and its immense privileges. Their primary weapon was no longer the scimitar, but the riot. The symbol of their discontent was the kazan, the great bronze soup cauldron from which each company ate. To overturn the kazan was the ultimate act of defiance, a signal that they refused the Sultan's bounty and were in open rebellion. Throughout Selim's reign, the cauldrons remained perilously close to tipping. The breaking point came in 1806 with the infamous Edirne incident. Selim, attempting to garrison his Nizami Jedid troops in Thrace, was met with a full-blown insurrection. The local Janissaries, backed by the region's conservative notables, refused to allow the new order soldiers to even enter the city. It was a humiliating public defeat for the Sultan. He was forced to recall his elite troops, revealing the stark limits of his authority. The incident sent a shockwave across the empire. It proved that the Janissaries were not merely a grumbling faction. They were an organized, armed and defiant political force capable of thwarting the Sultan's will. They were the muscle for the gathering storm of reaction, the violent instrument that the court conspirators knew they could wield. From that moment on, the Janissaries' shadow was no longer just a threat. It was a promise of the violence to come. A rebellion, no matter how righteous its fury, needs a banner to rally behind. A coup needs a candidate. For the enemies of Selim III, that candidate was waiting in the gilded prison of the Topkapi Palace, his cousin, Prince Mustafa. Raised in the suffocating confines of the Kafes, the cage, Mustafa was the embodiment of the old way. This system, designed to prevent civil war by keeping potential heirs under strict confinement, produced princes who were often isolated, paranoid, and deeply conservative. Mustafa was no exception. While Selim had spent his princely years corresponding with the King of France and studying European arts, Mustafa had marinated in the palace's atmosphere of intrigue and tradition. He viewed his cousin's reforms with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. He was not the architect of the conspiracy against Selim. He lacked the political cunning and the broad vision for that. Instead, he was the perfect figurehead, a legitimate Ottoman prince of sound mind and body, untainted by the foreign ideas that had so captivated the reigning sultan. The leaders of the reactionary movement, the Janissary Agas, the disgruntled viziers, the powerful Sheikh al-Islam, began to cultivate him. They whispered in his ear, stoking his ambition and validating his conservative instincts. They promised him the throne, not as a prize for his own merit, but as a restoration of the natural order. He would be the sultan who would dismantle the Nizami Jedid, expel the French advisors, and return the empire to its glorious past. The threat to Selim was no longer just a faceless mob or a shadowy cabal. It now had a name and a royal face. The dynastic struggle, the most dangerous game in the Ottoman court, had begun. Selim was no longer just fighting for his reforms. He was fighting his own blood for his throne and his life. The year is 1807. A fragile peace with Russia and a recent victory against the British fleet should have secured Selim III's position. But within the ancient walls of Istanbul, the seeds of sedition, sown over years of resentment, were beginning to sprout. The Sultan's grand project, the Nizam-ı Cedid, the new order, was not seen as salvation by all. To the Janissaries, it was a direct threat to their centuries-old privileges, a modern army destined to replace them. To many among the ulama, the religious scholars, its European-style methods were a blasphemous deviation from sacred tradition. For the common man, squeezed by new taxes to fund this unfamiliar army, it was simply another burden imposed by a distant sovereign. The spark fell in the garrisons of the Bosphorus forts. An order was given. The auxiliary soldiers, the yamaks, were to be issued the hated light blue tight-fitting uniforms of the Nizam-ı Cedid. It was a symbolic gesture, but symbols hold immense power. This was not merely a change of clothing, it was an assault on their identity. Refusal quickly escalated into mutiny. The cry of rebellion was raised, and a leader emerged from the ranks, a coarse, charismatic Albanian soldier named Kabakçı Mustafa. He was no great strategist, but he was the perfect vessel for the city's simmering rage. On May 25th, the revolt began in earnest. The yamaks, joined by disaffected Janissaries and a growing mob of students and artisans, marched from the Bosphorus towards the heart of the capital. They were a disorganized but furious tide, their banners proclaiming their loyalty to the Sultan, but demanding the heads of the infidel reformers who had misled him. The air in Istanbul grew thick with fear. Merchants shuttered their shops, and families barred their doors. The government, paralyzed by indecision, watched as the storm gathered on the horizon. Selim, the musician, the poet, the reformer, was about to hear the most discordant and terrifying symphony of his life, the sound of his own empire turning against him. As the rebel army swelled at the gates of Topkapi Palace, Sultan Selim III found himself caught in a vortex of disbelief and indecision. He, who had dedicated his life to strengthening the empire, could not comprehend that this fury was directed at him. He hesitated to unleash his loyal Nizam-ı Cedid troops, fearing a bloodbath in the streets of his capital, a civil war that would permanently scar the Ottoman soul. This fatal compassion would be his undoing. The rebels, sensing weakness, grew bolder. Their demands were clear and brutal: the complete and utter abolition of the new order and the delivery of 12 of Selim's most trusted reformist ministers and advisors. Seeking guidance, Selim turned to the highest religious authority in the empire, the Shaykhul Islam Ataullah Effendi. It was a desperate plea for legitimacy, for a voice of reason to calm the masses. Instead, he received the ultimate betrayal. The Shaykhul Islam, siding with the reactionaries, issued a fatwa, a legal religious decree, that not only justified the rebellion, but effectively sanctioned the dismantling of Selim's life's work. It was a devastating blow, a spiritual condemnation that left the Sultan utterly isolated. Hoping to quench the mob's thirst for blood and save his throne, Selim made a terrible choice. He acquiesced. He formally dissolved the Nizam-Assedid regiments, and one by one, sacrificed the architects of his dream. His loyal ministers, men like Mahmud Raif Effendi, were hunted down through the palace corridors and city streets, dragged from their hiding places, and savagely murdered by the frenzied crowd. Their bodies were mutilated and displayed as trophies. The gates of the palace had not just been opened to rebels. They had been opened to a wave of treason that washed away 2 decades of progress in a torrent of blood and fanaticism. Selim had fed the wolves his most loyal guards, only to find the pack was now staring directly at him. The blood of his friends and ministers had not sated the rebellion. It had only emboldened it. The concessions made by Sultan Selim III were perceived not as acts of mercy, but as the final spasms of a dying power. The leaders of the revolt, guided by shadowy figures in the court who saw their own path to the throne, now had a new, final demand: the abdication of the Sultan himself. The reformer had to be erased. The man who had dared to look westward for inspiration had to be cast down, a warning to all future sovereigns who might entertain such dangerous ideas. Inside the sprawling Topkapi Palace, the walls themselves seemed to close in on Selim. He was a sovereign in name only, a prisoner in his own home. The sounds from the courtyards were no longer the harmonious melodies of his own compositions, but the roaring of the mob and the triumphant shouts of the Janissaries he had tried to replace. His dream of a modern, resilient Ottoman state lay in ruins, shattered by the very people he had sought to save. There was no one left to turn to, no loyal army to call upon. Betrayal was absolute. On May 29, 1807, the final act of this political tragedy commenced. A second, fatal fatwa was issued by the Shaykhul Islam, declaring that a sultan who introduced foreign customs and violated the sacred principles of the Sharia was unfit to rule the abode of Islam. It was the legal and spiritual instrument of his demise. The rebel leaders, accompanied by the new Grand Vizier and the Shaykhul Islam, entered the palace not as subjects, but as executioners of a verdict. They found Selim not in the throne room, but in a private chamber, waiting with a profound and tragic dignity. He offered no resistance as they informed him of his fate. He was no longer sultan. In his place, they brought forth his cousin, Mustafa IV, a man whose weakness and conservatism made him the perfect puppet for the triumphant traditionalists. The light of reform was extinguished, and the empire was plunged back into darkness. For a deposed Ottoman sultan, the future was usually brief and brutal. But Selim III was not immediately met with the silken bowstring. Instead, he was escorted to the Kafes, the cage. This was not a literal cage of iron bars, but a series of opulent chambers within the palace, a gilded prison designed to house potential threats to the throne. Here, the man who once commanded armies and corresponded with European kings was now confined, his world shrinking to a few lavishly decorated rooms and a small enclosed courtyard. The vast empire he had struggled to reform was now a distant echo beyond his guarded walls. His days transformed from the complex statecraft of a ruler to the quiet contemplation of a prisoner. Yet, even in this constrained existence, his spirit refused to be broken. the musician Sultan returned to his art. The haunting, melancholic melodies of his ney flute once again drifted through the palace corridors, a testament to a creative fire that even treason could not extinguish. He composed music, practiced his elegant calligraphy, and spent time with the few loyal women of his harem who chose to share his confinement. Crucially, he was not alone in his royal imprisonment. His younger cousin, Mahmud, the only other surviving male of the royal line, was also confined nearby. Selim, seeing the future of the dynasty in the intelligent young prince, became his mentor. In secret conversations, hidden from the watchful eyes of Mustafa IV's guards, the deposed sultan shared his knowledge, his experiences, and the painful lessons of his reign. He spoke of the necessity of reform, of military modernization, of the dangerous power of the Janissaries. Selim was no longer trying to save his empire, but was instead planting the seeds of its future revival in the mind of his successor. He was a teacher in a cage, preparing another to finish the work he had started, all while knowing that every passing day brought the assassin's footstep closer to his door. From the turbulent frontiers of the Balkans, a storm was gathering. Its name was Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, the powerful governor of Rus, a man forged in the crucible of border warfare and a staunch believer in the vision of his deposed sultan. While the conspirators in Constantinople celebrated their victory, entrenching the weak and pliable Mustafa IV on the throne, Alemdar was gathering an army. This was not a rebellion. In his eyes, it was a restoration, a righteous crusade to save the empire from itself. His force, a formidable host of some 15,000 loyal soldiers, was a testament to the deep roots Selim's reforms had taken in the provinces, far from the capital's corrupt heart. The march on Constantinople began not with a roar, but with a grim, determined silence. Each league they crossed was a beat in a heart-pounding drum, counting down the final hours of the reactionary regime. This was the Nizami Jedid's last hope, embodied in the disciplined tramp of boots and the glint of steel under the summer sun. News of Alemdar's advance travelled faster than his army, carried by panicked messengers and whispered rumours that slithered through the city's bazaars and coffee houses. In the Topkapi Palace, the architects of Selim's downfall, the Sheikh-ul-Islam, the Janissary Agas, the court sycophants, felt a cold dread creep into their veins. They had caged the lion, but now his most loyal hunter was coming to break down the door. Their triumph was turning to ash in their mouths. They had unleashed the forces of tradition, but they had forgotten that tradition also bred men of unyielding loyalty and martial prowess like Alemdar. The city held its breath. The Janissaries, arrogant in their newfound power, patrolled the streets with a nervous swagger, their bravado a thin mask for their fear. The populace watched from behind shuttered windows, sensing the approach of a second, more violent reckoning. Alemdar's march was more than a military campaign. It was a race against the darkest impulses of a cornered and terrified regime. He was marching to save a man, but also an idea, the idea that the Ottoman Empire could change, that it could adapt and survive in a world that was rapidly leaving it behind. The question that hung heavy in the Balkan air, mingling with the dust of thousands of marching feet, was a simple, terrifying one. Would he be fast enough? While Alemdar's army thundered towards the capital, inside the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace, another rhythm played out, softer, more melancholic, and infinitely more tragic. Selim III, the Sultan of sonatas and reforms, was now a prisoner. The vast halls that once echoed with his compositions and the drills of his new army were now silent, save for the shuffling feet of his guards. His world had shrunk to a few opulent rooms in the Chinili Köşk, the tiled kiosk. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of his ambition, Selim confronted the ruin of his life's work. He was a man suspended between a past he could no longer reclaim and a future he would likely never see. Did he feel rage, despair, or the quiet resignation of an artist who sees his masterpiece smashed before his eyes? We know he turned to his lifelong solace, music. In these final, desperate days, it is said he composed some of his most profound and sorrowful works. He would take up his ney, the traditional reed flute, and its haunting melodies would drift through the palace gardens, a lament for a dying dream. This was not just music, it was a conversation with God, a final testament. Each note was a memory, the hope of his ascension, the thrill of creating the Nizami Jadid, the bitter taste of betrayal. He was composing a requiem for an emperor, himself. Whispers of Alamdar's approach would have reached him. But this news was a double-edged sword. It was a flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness, but it was also his death warrant. He knew his cousin Mustafa was a puppet. He knew the men pulling the strings were cowards, and he knew what cornered cowards do to the symbols of what they fear most. The approaching army was not just a force of liberation, it was a catalyst, accelerating his fate. His life was now tied to the speed of Alamdar's march. Every passing day, every prayer call echoing over the city, brought his potential saviors closer, but it also brought the assassin's blade nearer to his throat. The thunder arrived. On July 28, 1808, the vanguard of Alamdar Mustafa Pasha's army reached the gates of Constantinople. The city erupted in chaos. The conspirators' time had run out. Panic, raw and primal, seized the men who had orchestrated Selim's overthrow. Their puppet Sultan, Mustafa IV, was a terrified irrelevance. The real power, the Sheikh-ul-Islam Ataullah Effendi and the Janissary commanders, saw the abyss opening before them. In a final, desperate gambit to remove the very reason for Alamdar's crusade, they made a decision steeped in centuries of brutal palace logic. If the alternative to the throne is dead, the rebellion has no cause. The order was given. A fatwa was hastily procured, sanctioning the execution of the deposed sultan and his cousin, Prince Mahmud, the only other male heir of the House of Osman. A team of executioners, led by the chief black eunuch and other court officials, raced to Selim's chambers. This was not to be a quiet, dignified end. It was a frantic, ugly butchery. They burst into his rooms. Selim, no longer the gentle musician, but a cornered monarch, fought back with the ferocity of a man with nothing left to lose. He reportedly seized a small dagger, wounding one of his attackers before being overwhelmed. It was a symphony of blood and steel, a gruesome finale to a life dedicated to art and enlightenment. They strangled him with a bowstring, the traditional method for royal executions, ensuring no sacred Ottoman blood was spilled upon the ground. But his lifeblood soaked the carpets of his prison. His final composition was silence, punctuated by the grunts of his murderers and the final stolen gasp of a reformer's breath. As his body fell limp, the assassins moved on, their bloody work only half finished. They hunted for Prince Mahmud, to extinguish the Ottoman line and secure their own wretched survival. The dream of the Nizami Jadid had just been murdered in cold blood. Alamdar's forces stormed the Sublime Porte, the main gate of the government, and swiftly secured the palace grounds. But they were met not with the sight of their restored sultan, but with a horrifying tableau. The assassins, eager to prove their deed, had thrown Selim's body into the inner courtyard to be displayed to the rebels. The sight of the murdered sultan, the man he had marched across the country to save, broke something in Alamdar Mustafa Pasha. His grief instantly curdled into a terrible, cold fury. The race had been lost. The prize was this desecrated corpse. With Selim dead, the mission changed. It was no longer a restoration. It was vengeance. Alamdar immediately ordered the deposition and imprisonment of Mustafa IV. But who would rule? In the chaos of the assassination, the executioners had also pursued Prince Mahmud. He had been saved only by the quick thinking of a loyal concubine who hid him in the furnace of a bathhouse. Found covered in soot but alive, the terrified 23-year-old prince was brought before Alamdar and proclaimed Sultan Mahmud II. The throne he inherited was stained with his cousin's blood. Mahmud had learned a terrifying lesson in his first hour as sultan: that reform without absolute ruthless power was a death sentence. Selim's legacy was therefore not one of failure, but of martyrdom. He had shown the way forward, and his murder had starkly illustrated the price of progress. He had tried to persuade, to educate, to build consensus. His death proved that the old guard could not be persuaded, it could only be broken. The seeds of his Nizami Jedid, though trampled, had been planted in fertile ground, watered by his own blood. Years later, Sultan Mahmud II, remembering the fate of his gentle, artistic cousin, would orchestrate the auspicious incident, the complete and utter annihilation of the Janissary core. Selim's dream would finally be realized, not through a gentle sonata of reform, but through a brutal symphony of cannon fire and slaughter. The musician Sultan was dead, but his tragic final chord would echo through the final century of the Ottoman Empire.